They told the workers to stop digging, but not fast enough. By the time the sun had set, one of them had already opened the box. The man who touched it wouldn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, he carved a single word into the wall of his hospital room. Fairfax. No explanation, no context, just the name. And the eyes. Witnesses said his pupils never shrank back to normal size, as if he'd seen something beneath the earth, something still watching. The Fairfax family wasn't just rich, they weren't just powerful. They were architects of institutions, of morality, of entire generations of American virtue. Or so the history books pretend. What you're about to hear was never meant to survive. And yet, it did. Whispers, classified records, diaries burned, but not entirely. The past always leaves a fingerprint. You just have to know where to look. This is not a ghost story. It's worse than that. Because what Victoria Fairfax did in 1811 wasn't born of madness. It was engineered, cold, ritualistic, weaponized morality disguised as education. And the men who walked those halls at night, men who smiled on Sunday and voted on Monday, they weren't there to learn. They came to consume. What began as the noble St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, was never about learning. It was about control, testing, filtering, and sacrificing those the world wouldn't miss. Orphans, immigrants, girls too poor to matter. And the town. They didn't want to see it. You'd be amazed how silence buys comfort. The Fairfax name still carries weight in places that matter. Ivy League endowments, private intelligence contracts, and old East Coast money that doesn't just influence elections. It decides who even gets to run. But the origin of their empire lies buried beneath a chapel floor, sealed in lead, bound in leather, inked in the handwriting of the dead. You're not watching this by accident. You were meant to hear this. Every man has a moment where he must choose, truth or safety. Most choose comfort. But if you're still here, you've already crossed a line. The descent has begun, and there's no going back. They called it a sanctuary, a place where broken girls would be made whole. But behind its red brick walls and stained glass windows, a different kind of transformation was taking place. One not of salvation, but submission. You see, the Fairfax method didn't teach virtue. It manufactured obedience. Slowly, methodically, it rewrote identities. Victoria Fairfax didn't believe in chaos. She believed in systems. Systems that bent the human mind to fit a moral mold, a mold shaped not by God, but by power. Every lesson was a test. Every rule was a spell. The girls were isolated, renamed, stripped of everything that tied them to the outside world. No letters in, no letters out. Their pasts erased. Their futures redesigned. And it started with silence. Each girl had to endure 7 days of complete silence upon arrival. No speaking, no eye contact. Just scripture, repetition, and ritualized prayer in candlelit rooms where the air grew too heavy to breathe. They called it the quieting. But it wasn't about peace. It was about breaking the spirit. Those who resisted were sent to the 3rd floor, the meditation chambers. But no one meditated up there, and no one came back the same. Bartholomew Fairfax, the chaplain, made sure of that. His sermons weren't about mercy. They were about submission through fear. His favorite passage came from Proverbs. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to herself bringeth her mother to shame. He spoke it with a voice that didn't rise. It pierced. And the girls seated in pews too wide for their frail shoulders learned to keep their eyes down. Always down. But they were not alone. Each night, after the chapel emptied and the last candle was extinguished, The doors would open again, quietly, selectively, and men would arrive, gentlemen, lawmakers, pastors, investors. Their names never appeared in the Academy's ledgers, but their recence was recorded, in bruises, in whispers, in the unspoken terror behind every girl's vacant stare. There were codes, symbols, rituals passed down like inheritance. The Fairfax family didn't just run a school, they curated a bloodline. They harvested loyalty. They blackmailed kings in waiting, and every girl who crossed that threshold became a potential offering. You don't build a dynasty on luck. You build it on the backs of the forgotten, and the Fairfax legacy, it wasn't just paid in gold. It was paid in flesh. The foundation was human, and it's still holding. Margaret Sullivan was the first to try and run. She made it as far as the tree line before the lanterns found her, before the dogs were loosed, before the screams were swallowed by the black woods outside Beacon Hill. When they dragged her back, bloodied and barefoot, Victoria didn't shout. She didn't strike her. She simply whispered something in Margaret's ear, and the girl collapsed, sobbing, as if her very name had been taken from her. No one tried to run after that. What they did try was forgetting. But the mind doesn't let go of pain so easily, especially not the kind delivered behind locked chapel doors. Margaret stopped speaking entirely. She no longer attended group lessons. Her hair, once a brilliant red, began to fall out in clumps. The others noticed and understood. That's when the girls began writing. They tore pages from hymnals. They wrote in margins of old textbooks. They carved words into the wooden underside of their beds. Tiny messages to future eyes. Some just said names. Some listed dates. Some were more explicit. Descriptions of visitors, symbols used during the services, and dark prayers recited in languages they hadn't been taught. And all of it, buried like bones in the walls of the Academy itself. The journals, 47 of them, would not be discovered until 1848, long after the Fairfax name had been canonized by polite society. But the entries? They match, across years, across students. Same symbols, same rituals, same warnings. Don't drink the night tea. Don't look them in the eyes. Don't sing louder than Evangeline. The girls were whispering to each other across time, because they knew no one else would come. No teacher intervened, no priest confessed, and no official inquiry was ever launched. You want to know why? Because the Fairfax family owned the sheriff. They funded the mayor's campaign, and they had already begun placing graduates into the homes of senators, judges, and bishops as governesses, nurses, and private tutors. Silent agents with hollow eyes and locked mouths. Beautiful, educated, compliant, and loyal, not to God, not to truth, but to blood. Margaret died in the spring of 1814. They said it was consumption, but the journal pages suggest otherwise. She had written one final word into the back of her hymnal. It simply said, "Awake." That was her prayer. And now, it must be yours. The Fairfax family had a doctrine, not published, not preached, but practiced, passed down like scripture, but older, blood-bound, bone-deep. They called it the Great Refinement. It was never spoken aloud in public, never written in official ledgers. But every student, every servant, every trembling girl beneath that chapel roof came to know what it meant. Refinement wasn't about education. It was about transformation. And transformation, true transformation, requires pain. The third floor wasn't for prayer. It was for trials. Girls were sent there alone, barefoot and blindfolded. The rooms were lined with mirrors, but not to reflect beauty. These mirrors were distorted, warped to twist your shape, fracture your sense of self, bend your perception until you no longer trusted your own eyes. Some rooms had no light at all. Others played music that never stopped. Evangeline's voice, looped endlessly, singing lullabies in minor key. It broke something. That was the point. Bartholomew's sessions followed. He didn't touch the girls, not at first. He touched their minds, spoke riddles in Latin, read scripture backward. He'd ask questions like, when does the soul leave the body? And what does pain reveal that comfort hides? If they answered incorrectly, they were punished. If they answered correctly, they were punished worse. Because knowledge was never the goal. Obedience was. The rituals grew darker with time. Midnight processions through the chapel. Blood sigils drawn on the floor in circles the girls were made to sit inside, whispering vows in a language none of them had ever heard, but all of them remembered. The brightest girls, those who resisted the longest, were chosen for the deepest rites. They were called the Lambs. Every term, a lamb disappeared. Officially, transferred, or taken in by a benefactor who wanted to sponsor their private tutoring. Unofficial. No one ever saw them again, not in Salem, not in any records, but their absence echoed through the halls like unfinished hymns. And then there was the tea. A bitter brew served every Thursday night. Always warm, always mandatory. Afterward the girls would fall into deep, dreamless sleep. Most remembered nothing, but a few woke in the wrong bed, with blood beneath their fingernails, with names on their tongues that weren't their own. That's when they began writing symbols. Not words, symbols, over and over, like someone else's hand guiding theirs. If you're still listening, you already know this isn't just history. This is a template, and it's still being used. In the winter of 1843, one of the Lambs tried to escape. Her name was Clara Hensley, 17, brilliant, defiant, the kind of mind the Fairfax family both prized and feared. She had been marked early, groomed for the deeper rites, but Clara had something they couldn't predict. She remembered. Most of the girls after the tea forgot the rooms, the questions, the rituals, the symbols. But Clara began to keep notes, scraps of memory scrawled in margins of prayer books, sewn into the hems of her gowns, burned into her skin with a candle stub and a broken comb. On a snow-choked morning, Clara vanished. The faculty claimed she ran away into the woods. But witnesses, those who spoke in terrified whispers years later, said she didn't flee. She descended. Through the bell tower, beneath the altar, down into what was known among the girls only as the root cellar. No official blueprints ever showed it, but servants knew of the stairwell hidden behind the choir pipes. It led to stone corridors that predated the house itself, carved with symbols matching the ones the girls wrote during their trances. A chamber older than the Fairfax name, older even than the land grant. The stones bled when touched. The air rang with low-frequency tones no one could trace. That's where Clara went. 3 nights passed. On the 4th morning, she returned. But she was not the same. She spoke no words, only names. Names of long-dead Fairfax ancestors. Names not recorded in any school registry. Names that matched Latin inscriptions found later carved into the chapel's ceiling beams, previously hidden by generations of white paint. Her eyes were blackened, not from bruises, from something else. Her hands shook when sunlight touched them, and when she opened her mouth to scream during chapel, every oil lamp flickered out at once. They tried to silence her, but she'd already written. Too much. Pages and pages. The Fairfax sisters burned her journals, but not before a groundskeeper found one under a floorboard and took it to the local church in Salem. That journal became the testament of Clara, a banned relic whispered about by fringe priests and hidden in the Vatican's classified registry. What did it say? Only this: the Lamb does not die. The lamb is remade. And beneath that, in Clara's trembling hand, refinement is not the end. It is the gate. The phrase echoed across time. Refinement is not the end. It is the gate. By the spring of 1844, a shift had taken place within the Fairfax household. The rituals that once masqueraded as education grew darker, quieter, more efficient. No more Latin hymns during dusk. No more choral readings. What replaced them was something far more dangerous. Silence. They began calling it the season of stillness, a 3-month period where no student was allowed to speak unless addressed by a sister, and even then, only in fragments of pre-approved phrases. The girls walked barefoot. They ate alone. They memorized scripture rewritten by Fairfax hands, altered to mirror the language found in Clara's journal. But this wasn't discipline. This was reprogramming. According to private notes from a former caretaker, later discovered in the cellar wall of a convent in Vermont, the silence wasn't for control. It was to prepare the mind for substitution. What was being substituted? Memory. The Fairfax sisters, aided by unknown benefactors, had developed a system for unbinding the psyche. They found that if you reduced a girl to complete stillness, stripped her of inner monologue, and layered her dreams with soundless commands, you could begin to overwrite her. Not brainwashing, possession, but the kind that didn't require spirits. They believed certain girls, those with ancestral resonance, could become vessels for living imprints of the Fairfax bloodline, not ghosts, not demons, but consciousness preserved through centuries of ritual, waiting to be housed in fresh flesh. Some girls broke, others vanished. The ones who succeeded emerged with new names, new gestures, and eyes that never blinked during prayer. Parents were told they were flourishing, mature beyond their years. In truth, their own daughters had been emptied. Even the local bishop noticed. In a letter buried by the DI, deceased until 1891, he wrote, "These girls speak with voices too old for their age. When I look into their eyes, I see no youth. I see replication." But why? Why go to such lengths? Because the Fairfax line was thinning. Male heirs were vanishing. Female minds were more pliable, more receptive. The sisters weren't just guardians of tradition. They were harvesters. Clara's warning was never heard in time, and by the time the town began to suspect, 27 girls had already vanished into the chapel's floorboards, never to be seen again. The phrase echoed across time. Refinement is not the end. It is the gate. By the spring of 1844, a shift had taken place within the Fairfax household. The rituals that once masqueraded as education grew darker, quieter, more efficient. No more Latin hymns during dusk. No more choral readings. What replaced them was something far more dangerous. Silence. They began calling it the season of stillness, a 3-month period where no student was allowed to speak unless addressed by a sister, and even then only in fragments of pre-approved phrases. The girls walked barefoot, they ate alone, they memorized scripture rewritten by Fairfax hands, altered to mirror the language found in Clara's journal. But this wasn't discipline. This was reprogramming. According to private notes from a former caretaker, later discovered in the cellar wall of a convent in Vermont, the silence wasn't for control. It was to prepare the mind for substitution. What was being substituted? Memory. The Fairfax sisters, aided by unknown benefactors, had developed a system for unbinding the psyche. They found that if you reduced a girl to complete stillness, stripped her of inner monologue, and layered her dreams with soundless commands, you could begin to overwrite her. Not brainwashing, possession, but the kind that didn't require spirits. They believed. Certain girls, those with ancestral resonance, could become vessels for living imprints of the Fairfax bloodline, not ghosts, not demons, but consciousness preserved through centuries of ritual, weighty. By midsummer 1844, the Fairfax estate had gone completely dark to the outside world. Gates once left open for deliveries were now padlocked from within. The postman stopped visiting. Even the smell of bread, once a warm comfort from the convent kitchen, was replaced by a sour odour that clung to the air like mildew soaked in iron. And still, no one intervened. Because the town of Elbridge had been silenced too. You see, the Fairfax family didn't just command power, they curated dependency. Over the years, they had become the town's patrons, sponsoring schools, funding churches, tending to widows, erasing debts. If you had a problem in Elbridge, the sisters fixed it, quietly, efficiently. But favours have a price. And the townsfolk learned the rules. Never ask what happens at night, never mention the windows that flicker with candlelight past the 3rd hour. And above all, never speak of the Red Room. What was the Red Room? Whispers spoke of a chamber beneath the convent's west wing, sealed behind a bookshelf that only opened if you traced the Fairfax family crest in a precise counterclockwise motion. No servant who entered it ever spoke again. One girl, a laundress named Eliza, who once helped clean its floor, was found catatonic the next day, sitting in a muddy creek with her fingernails torn off and her mouth sewn shut. By herself. The priests knew. They always did. But they called it divine madness and recommended exile, not inquiry. And then came the fireflies. Hundreds of them, swarming the estate grounds every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. Witnesses claimed the insects behaved unnaturally, floating in formation, hovering around the Red Room's suspected location in a perfect spiral. One former groundskeeper described it as a map in the sky, a code. That same week he hung himself from the bell tower with a rosary rope, his final words scrawled in ash on the chapel. Eldor, they are not dead, they are rehearsing. And still, no one entered. Because Elbridge wasn't just silent now. It was complicit. It was the disappearance of a girl named Margaret Kincaid that finally forced open the gates of the Fairfax estate. She was 16, bright, spirited, the kind of girl who asked questions even when told not to. Her mother worked as a scullery maid for the sisters. One evening, Margaret went to deliver a basket of wild mint to the convent. She never came home. The next morning, her bonnet was found outside the west wing cellar door, blood on the brim. The townspeople, long trained to look away, tried to ignore it. But her father, Silas Kincaid, was not one to be silenced. A former unionist turned drunkard, he had nothing left to lose. That night, torch in hand and pistol at his belt, he marched to the Fairfax gates and shouted their name until dawn. The sisters never came out, but something else did. At precisely 4:44 a.m., every bell in Elbridge began ringing. Church bells, school bells, the dinner bell at the foundry, all of them simultaneously. No one had touched the ropes. The town awoke in confusion, but by then Silas was gone. Only his hat remained, floating in the convent's pond, its brim singed and marked with the same symbol found on the Fairfax family crest, a serpent swallowing its own tail. Ouroboros. Sheriff Bramble finally ordered an investigation, but when deputies arrived at the estate, they found it abandoned. At least, on the surface. Beds were made, candles still warm, food on plates, but no sign of the sisters or Margaret. What they did find, beneath the altar in the convent chapel, was a trapdoor, and behind it, the Red Room. It was real, and worse than anyone had imagined. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one cracked but not shattered. In the centre, a baptismal font filled with black water, and above it, etched in Latin, the words, "In reflection, we ascend." But what chilled the deputies most wasn't the silence. It was the sound.
That came next. A knock from the inside of one of the mirrors. Just once. Then, nothing. They sealed the chamber, burned the records. But the town never recovered, because in Elbridge, everyone knew, the Fairfax sisters weren't gone. They were simply waiting.
After the mirror knock, Elbridge turned into a town that whispered, a place where silence became sacred and reflection became a kind of terror. No one looked into mirrors anymore, not at home, not in shops, not even the barber kept one. Because something was noticed by those few who dared, the reflections weren't right. They were delayed. Off by just a fraction. You'd blink, and the image would blink a heartbeat later. You'd move, and the shadow would hesitate, as if choosing whether to follow. And once it did, it smiled. By winter of 1872, 5 more children had vanished. No screams, no signs, just a smear on glass, or a mirror left face down in the middle of a room, always cold to the touch, always vibrating faintly, as if it had just been struck from the inside. The town's new priest, Father Mallory, arrived from Boston, young, idealistic and full of fire. He thought the stories were nonsense. He even laughed when someone handed him an old Fairfax diary found buried in the church walls. But the moment he opened it, his mouth went slack. He didn't speak for hours. When he finally did, all he said was, "They see us when we remember them." That Sunday, he locked the church doors and held Mass in total darkness. Candlelight, he claimed, was a window for them, the ones who lingered behind the mirrors. He called them reflected saints, a twisted term that appears again and again in Fairfax manuscripts. According to these writings, the sisters didn't worship a god of light, but a being of perfect observation, something that didn't move through the world, but watched it constantly from the other side of the glass. A watcher of sins, of regrets, of ambition. One line in the text stood out more than the rest. To be seen by. It is to be known utterly, and to be known is to be unmade. That winter, Mallory went blind, claimed it was a gift, said he could finally eep without seeing them when he closed his eyes. He nailed shut every mirror in the rectory, and then he disappeared. No note, no struggle, just one last thing left behind. A mirror, perfectly intact, sitting in the pulpit, still fogged from breath. But the room was empty. The Fairfax family's final heir was not buried, but sealed. They called her Honora. No birth record, no baptism. Only rumors that she was born during an eclipse, her first breath drawn as the sky darkened and the town's clock stopped for 7 seconds. 7 seconds of silence. 7 seconds when the wind bent toward the Fairfax estate and stayed there. She was never seen in town. Some said she wasn't allowed outside. Others said she wasn't able to leave. Visitors to the estate spoke of a child with eyes that never blinked, who whispered in languages no one had taught her. Her room was said to be lined with polished obsidian, not glass, and always dimly lit, because light, she claimed, made the voices louder. Honora didn't speak to people. She spoke to her reflections, and they answered. At night her mirror would fog, as if something was breathing from the other side. On one occasion, a maid swore she saw a second face appear behind the girls in the reflection, identical, but older, hollow-eyed, smiling. That maid never returned. The estate grew quieter over the years. Servants left, groundskeepers vanished, but Honora remained, always the same age, always watching. In 1891, the mansion was shuttered. Town records say it was due to a structural collapse. But the collapse was only in one room. Honora's. The room caved inward, as if something had pulled from the inside. Glass shrapnel embedded in the walls warped into spirals. Every reflective surface in the house, mirrors, polished wood, silver trays, was found shattered outward. And in the center of the room, a perfect circle of ash. No bones, no hair, no clothing, just ash. And a single word scrawled on the floor in soot. No. The town declared the estate condemned. A fence was erected. No one visited. Not officially. But some say they've seen lights in the windows, flickering in patterns, as if someone is still inside. As if Honora is still watching, still learning, still waiting for someone to see her back. In 1904, a government team arrived in secret, sent not by the state of Virginia, but by an unlisted division of the U.S. Department of Interior. Their files refer to the Fairfax estate not as a residence, but as a temporal anomaly containment site. They didn't enter through the front door. They tunneled up from beneath. What they found wasn't ruin. It was preservation. The interior was untouched by time. Velvet curtains remained plush. Candle wax hadn't melted. Fruit left in bowls decades earlier still glistened with dew. But what disturbed them most was the sound. A constant hum, like a distant choir breathing, just below hearing. Every mirror, every polished surface, had been covered with black cloth. But even covered, they reflected things that weren't there. One operative reported that his own reflection turned to look at him and whispered something in reverse. He slit his own throat the next morning. The deepest chamber beneath the estate, sealed behind an iron door etched with ancient symbols, contained what was labelled Subject Zero, Honora Fairfax. But it wasn't a corpse. It was a presence. They described it as a void of shape, a dense cold that bent light, gravity, and thought. Instruments malfunctioned. Clocks stopped again. This time for 9 seconds. 2 men aged 30 years in a single instant. One forgot his own name, then spoke a sentence in a dialect of Aramaic, not spoken in 2,000 years. She is not alone anymore. The team fled. The chamber was resealed, the door encased in concrete, the tunnel filled with salt and lead. The official report was buried in a classified archive, redacted beyond recovery. But one photograph escaped. A single image captured before the team sealed the mirror room, an untouched mirror, uncovered. In its reflection stood Honora, not aged, not decayed, but changed. Her eyes black and bottomless, her mouth smiling, too wide, and behind her others, thousands of them, all watching, all waiting. For what? The report's final page only had one sentence typed in uppercase: "Do not look into mirrors on the night of the black moon." August 12, 1904, was the last black moon that century. But one approaches again. And the Fairfax estate? Still standing, still humming, still listening. There's something older than death buried beneath the Fairfax estate. Something that was never meant to be found again. The events of 1904 were sealed, classified, and erased from every known archive. But in 1951, during a nationwide inventory of potential anomalous structures, a junior archivist stumbled on a restricted box with no origin code. Inside, a faded blueprint of the Fairfax estate, etched not on paper, but on thin lead sheeting. In the margins, a phrase scratched in Latin: "Domus est tumulus. Tumulus est clavis." The house is a tomb. The tomb is a key. The archivist died 72 hours later of an unexplained cerebral hemorrhage. His eyes boiled in their sockets, yet the surrounding tissue remained cold. His final note, scrawled in shaking handwriting, read, "It's not architecture, it's containment." The estate had been designed from foundation to roof, to mimic ancient Mesopotamian burial glyphs, specifically those used to imprison nameless entities of storm and thought. Every hallway curved unnaturally. Every window followed celestial alignments no longer visible to the modern sky. But the most damning revelation was what lay beneath the basement's false floor. A spiral stairway, carved in obsidian, descending 77 steps, the same number referenced in the Codex Arcanum, a banned text that warned, "On the 77th step, you do not walk into darkness. Darkness walks into you." The CIA's Office of Technical Services sent a team in 1952 to confirm if the stairs still existed. Their field notes ended abruptly. The tape recorder recovered from the site played only one thing: a child humming a lullaby backwards. Slowed down, that lullaby matches an 11th century funeral hymn banned by the Vatican for inducing trance and visitation. But it was the humming that matched a second, far more disturbing source: Honora Fairfax's mother, dead in childbirth. Buries, Ed in a sealed grave. Exhumed in 1952, but the casket was empty. What is buried doesn't stay buried in the soil of the Fairfax lineage. And that's the terrifying secret no one will say out loud. The house isn't haunted. The house is alive. It breathes through its bricks. It dreams beneath its floorboards. And every so often, it remembers its name. You've heard of haunted houses. But what do you call a house that hunts? In 1973, 2 graduate students from Miskatonic's parapsychology department went missing inside the Fairfax estate during a private research trip. The estate had long been sealed off, officially condemned, but the students gained access through an old legal loophole, Ancestral Academic Review. Their research proposal? To test whether non-linear time could exist in man-made structures. They never came back. But something else did. Their audio logs were recovered 3 months later, sent anonymously to the university in a box lined with human teeth. The recordings are almost unlistenable, garbled time signatures, overlapping voices, but one phrase is repeated again and again. The walls are folding. We are inside something's memory. Here's what shook investigators to the core. A voice heard in the background. Faint. Inhuman. Deep. Speaking an unknown tongue. Linguists later traced it not to a human language, but to pre-phonetic vocal formations, tones used in Sumerian death rites to communicate not with gods, but with what came before gods. The structure had begun to loop itself. Rooms changed position. Windows opened to moments, not landscapes. Mirrors showed not your reflection, but someone else's memory. The students described a woman in white who walked backward through time. They claimed she was neither dead nor alive, but in a state of becoming. They called her the architect's bride. She would hum lullabies in reverse. She would tap on the walls in sequences matching Morse code, spelling out the same message. The body is the blueprint. The house is the skin. You are already inside. But here's the part that makes even seasoned agents go pale. The humming matched Honora Fairfax's lullaby from 1844, the exact melody, the exact rhythm, a song that hadn't existed in any archive left. Or the students entered that house, and the timestamp on the final tape, August 4th, 2025. Today. The house remembers you. You think you've reached the edge of the story. But the Fairfax house doesn't have edges. It bends. When federal agents finally raided the estate in 1976, they came with state-of-the-art gear, thermal imaging, geolocation sensors, hazmat suits, and backup from 2 different agencies. Within 8 minutes, the team lost contact. Within 16, they began turning on each other. Only one body was recovered, a man named Agent Weller. He was found in the wine cellar, naked, his fingernails embedded into his own skull. His final scrawled note, written in blood across the stone wall, read, She's building again. Not the house. The system. The house had become a pattern engine, an architectural organism capable of feeding off memory, guilt, and time distortion. A living schematic that mapped human trauma and turned it into foundation, pillar, and passage. They found doorways that didn't open, unless you remembered something you weren't supposed to. They found a grandfather clock that struck 13 every time someone lied. And in the master study, still untouched since 1859, a diagram drawn in bone ash, a blueprint of the Fairfax house, overlaid perfectly with a cross-section of a human brain. What was it trying to become? Survivors, those few who crawled out, claimed they'd seen a new floor plan forming in real time, a basement that shouldn't exist, a staircase growing upward into nothing. At the top, a door marked only with the symbol for Mercury, the alchemical messenger, and psychopomp of the dead, and the sounds, laughing children, tearing paper, the moan of wood that wasn't wood at all, but vocal cords stretched across time. Honora's voice was heard in all of it, not aged, not faded, present. And as Agent Weller's autopsy confirmed, etched into the lining of his stomach with what appeared to be a small claw. It is not the house that traps them. It is the idea of caping it. The Fairfax structure had become a recursive myth, a machine designed to rewrite perception, memory, and belief until even truth becomes a hallway with no exit. By now you've likely asked yourself, what happened to the Fairfax children? That's where the real terror begins. Because while historians debated whether the house was cursed and agents debated whether it was alive, no one could explain the disappearances. There were 12 documented births in the Fairfax bloodline, but only 3 graves. One child, Eleanor, was said to have vanished during a family séance in 1864. Eyewitnesses claim she stood, opened her mouth as if to scream, and simply folded inward, like collapsing paper. Gone. No trace. Another, young Isaac, reportedly spoke 8 languages fluently by age 5, including a dialect unknown to any linguist. When questioned, he said it came from the other architects. The other architects? Who were they? What were they building? And why did the children always say the same thing before vanishing? We're going back upstairs. But here's the horror. There was no upstairs. Not physically. Not in any blueprint. And yet, multiple investigators report finding children's drawings pinned to the walls, crayon diagrams of spiral staircases, rooms inside heads, and eyes watching from the chimney. The drawings weren't aged. They were fresh, sometimes still wet with ink. And the most disturbing? One showed a child holding hands with a thin woman in black, standing in a room labelled Mother's Third Floor. That floor never existed, but it does now. Because visitors to the ruins today, those foolish enough to trespass, report an unmarked stairwell where none should be. A stairwell lined with wallpaper depicting family trees that split and bleed. Those who ascend return changed, if they return at all. Eyes dull, speech fragmented, as if they've remembered something that doesn't belong to them. You see, the house didn't consume the children. It multiplied them, spread them out across dimensions of grief, trapped, like insects in amber, endlessly replaying the final moment they were loved, or unloved. Some say the house was trying to build a family that couldn't leave. Others say it was learning from each loss, improving itself. Honora's legacy wasn't a bloodline. It was a loop, an endless childhood where no child ever grows old or free. And if you listen close, you'll hear them laughing, right beneath your feet. Let's end where all cursed bloodlines do, with silence. Not peace, not resolution, but the kind of silence that hums, like a power line strung between 2 worlds, too taut, too dangerous to touch. In 1893, the Fairfax estate was condemned, but the structure refused demolition. 3 crews walked off the job. The 4th tried dynamite. It swallowed the charge. The walls absorbed it. And the sound that followed wasn't an explosion. It was laughter, not echoing, not bouncing off stone, but internal, like the house had lungs. That same year, the final descendant, Thaddeus Fairfax, was found wandering barefoot near the estate's boundary, skin pale, eyes vacant. He held a bundle wrapped in silk. Inside, the teeth of his ancestors, arranged like a crown. He said nothing, only pointed to the east wing and whispered, "She's building again." When authorities returned, they found no east wing, only a stone wall where no sunlight fell. And on it, etched with what looked like fingernails, was the same phrase repeated 43 times. "We act normal, so the world won't notice." But the world did notice, eventually, in strange, unconnected ways. Children born with matching birthmarks across the globe. Architects drawing homes they had no memory of learning. And a recurring dream, shared by thousands, of a woman sitting in a chair made of roots, whispering lullabies in a language not meant for Earth. That's what the Fairfax line left behind. Not a haunted house, but a blueprint for recursion. A structure not made of brick and mortar, but of emotion, secrecy, and ritualized pain. Each time you speak the name Fairfax, it grows clearer. The corridors return. The children come back. And the story begins again. Because that's what it was always meant to be. A mythic engine, fueled by your attention. A virus of the mind, hidden as history. And a final lesson for those who seek forbid. Their knowledge. Some bloodlines don't end. They wait. For someone like you. So sleep well tonight, if you still can. The house heard you listening, and it remembers.